He was shorter than most, with a bald head and a long brownish-red beard, which gave him the appearance of some mythical forest creature. His brows were thick and bushy and arched above his dark eyes, giving the impression that he was always shocked or surprised. By physical appearance, Henri Landru looked more like a clown than a killer who swindled more than 300 women out of their life savings. But there was something special about this bourgeois second-hand furniture dealer without a conscience that vulnerable women found irresistible. And for 10 of them, their willingness to believe the lies Landru told them would cost them more than their meager fortunes. The price they paid for falling under the spell of this wretch was their lives. Born of parents of modest means in 1869, Landru's childhood and early years were nondescript. Young Henri was a bright lad who attended Catholic school and was admitted as a sub-deacon in the religious order of St. Louis-en-Lille. By his teen years, Landru had realized that he was clever and glib with the ladies. In 1891, he seduced his cousin, Mademoiselle Remy, who became pregnant and bore him a daughter. He was drafted and excelled in military life, rising to the rank of sergeant. 2 years after enlisting, Landru married Mademoiselle Remy while he was quartermaster of the regiment at St. Quentin. Upon discharge, Landru went into business as a clerk. His employer, however, was unscrupulous and absconded with the money Landru had given him as a bond. Incensed with this blow which fate had dealt, Landru said he made a vow to get revenge through a life of crime. Despite his standing as a deacon and member of the choir of his church, Landru became a part-time swindler. His targets were most often the middle-aged widows he met through his legitimate furniture business. Faced with the prospect of long, lonely, poverty-stricken lives, these women came to him to sell their possessions. Landru would prey on their fears and, in addition to taking their possessions, wooed his victims and enticed them to let him invest their meager pensions, which he promptly stole. The scam worked well until 1900, when Landru made his first appearance in a French courtroom, being sentenced to a 2-year prison term for fraud. For the next decade, Landru was in and out of prisons 7 times, spending more time inside a cell than out. He remained married to Remy, and together they had 4 children. Sometime around 1908, he apparently struck upon the scheme that would eventually bring him to the guillotine. In that year, Landru, already serving a sentence in a Parisian prison for fraud, was brought to Lille to stand trial for another scam. He had placed a matrimonial advertisement in a newspaper, portraying himself as a well-to-do widower seeking the companionship of a similarly situated widow. In return for some counterfeit deeds, Landru persuaded a 40-year-old widow to part with a 15,000 franc dowry. Madame Isor was left destitute and sought recompense through the courts. She would have to content herself with the knowledge that Landru would serve an additional 3 years, for the dowry, worth about $50,000 in current dollars, was gone. He was released shortly before the Great War, most likely with the understanding that he would re-enlist in the French army. He had already driven his father to suicide over his lawlessness and left his family penniless and humiliated. Rather than serve his country in the middle of a horrific war, he drifted around the countryside, well aware of the fact that he had been convicted in absentia for various other offenses and sentenced to lifelong transportation to New Caledonia in the Coral Sea west of Australia. Certainly not the appropriate place for gentlemen like himself, he thought. Once the war started, Landru, who was estranged from Remy, began the scams that led to his downfall. Perhaps it was the war with its heretofore unknown measure of death that turned Landru into a murderer. Perhaps it was the years spent in harsh French prisons. Or perhaps it was something else. The Earl of Birkenhead, eminent Oxford don and author of famous trials of history, discounted the theory that Landru was driven by bloodlust to kill his female suitors. There seems to be no evidence of that, he wrote in the 1929 follow-up to Famous Trials.
A man who embarks on this kind of adventure must shake himself free of entanglement. It is therefore inevitable that a proportion of the women would be difficult to shake off, and some must have shown no great disposition to hand over their property. The obvious means of overcoming their attachment was to destroy them, and to do so was only too easy. We must therefore postulate that he was callous and inhuman, an assumption which offers no difficulty, seeing that his very mode of life was impossible for any other kind of man.
and his method of killing is unknown, but evidence at his villa suggests that the slayings were most likely quick and clean, and that the victims were probably not defiled in any way. Lust was not his primary motive, and he is among the minority of serial killers, where anger, revenge, or sexual release are at best secondary motivators. In 1914, the following advertisement appeared in the Paris newspapers: "Widower with 2 children, aged 43, with comfortable income, serious and moving in good society, desires to meet widow with a view to matrimony." For a French war widow facing a life of loneliness and penury in the depressed economy of wartime France, such an advertisement must have seemed heaven-sent. Landru, who placed the ad, had no trouble meeting women. Determining just who Landru wooed and when is naturally difficult, and by the dates of his murders, it is clear that he had multiple scams going at a time. His reliance on aliases helps muddy the picture. The first woman to meet this predator was Madame Couchet, a 39-year-old woman with a 16-year-old son, André. Couchet worked in a lingerie shop in Paris and was barely keeping her head above water when she made Landru's acquaintance. He told her his name was Monsieur Diard and that he was an engineer. Their relationship flourished over time, but was not without its ups and downs. Landru's scheme was almost revealed before it had a chance to flower after Couchet and the man she called Diard had a falling out. Couchet begged her family and brother-in-law to accompany her to Landru's villa near Chantilly, with the hopes of ironing out their differences. Landru was not in when they arrived, but the family apparently felt enough at home to search the place. Her brother-in-law found a chest filled with many letters from other women and informed Couchet that her lover was a fraud. She chose to disregard her family's advice to dump Landru and instead furnished a villa at Vernouillet, outside Paris, and became estranged from her family. The last time Couchet and André were seen alive was in January 1915. Shortly after the three moved into Vernouillet, Landru opened a bank account with 5,000 francs, which he claimed was part of his inheritance from his father. In all likelihood, the money came from Couchet. Soon after Couchet's disappearance, Landru's wife was presented with Couchet's watch as a present. His next victim was an Argentine named Madame Laborde-Line, the widow of a hotelier. She told friends that she was planning to marry a charming engineer from Brazil, but frustrated with the red tape, the pair decided to dispense with the ceremony and move in together. Afterward, a man that her former neighbors identified as Landru came back and collected her furniture, sending some to his villa and the rest to a garage. Laborde-Line was last seen in July 1915, when she arrived at the villa with her 2 dogs. Madame Guillen, a 51-year-old widow whose full name was Marie-Angélique Désirée Pelletier, was last seen at the villa a month later. Also in 1915, Madame Héon visited Vernouillet and disappeared. Whether or not there were others between the murders of Héon and 19-year-old Mademoiselle André Babelet, a servant girl who disappeared in early 1917 en route to visiting her mother, only heaven knows. Why Babelet was killed is also a mystery. She had no money of her own. After Babelet disappeared, Landru left Vernouillet for a new villa in Gambès and promptly had a large cast-iron oven installed. He laid low for a time, but soon returned to his murderous ways. Landru had been courting Buisson, a wealthy widow, for nearly a year before he succeeded in creating an estrangement from her family. She moved with him to Gambès without her son, who went to live with his aunt. In April 1917, Buisson was seen for the last time. His next victim at Gambès was Louise Léopoldine Jaume, who disappeared in September 1917. After her disappearance, Landru's new neighbors in Gambès noticed black, noxious smoke pouring from his villa. Annette Pascal, 38, followed Jaume by vanishing in the spring of 1918, and finally, Marie-Thérèse Marchadier, an entertainer known among the non-commissioned officers of French army as La Belle Miteuse, and who had retired to relative anonymity in Paris, was visited by Landru, who wanted to purchase her furniture. A friendship blossomed, and she accompanied the murderer to Gambès in late 1918 and promptly disappeared. In all, at least 10 women and 1 boy and 2 dogs had disappeared after meeting Landru, yet no police had ever suspected him of any misdeeds. It would take a pair of anxious families to bring Landru at long last to justice. Landru had taken great pains to separate his victims from their families, but after their deaths he took equally strong measures to reassure the families that their loved ones were well. Most killers for financial gain do not destroy the evidence of their victims' deaths. In insurance or inheritance scams, proof of death is often required. Few killers want to wait a decade or so to collect their ill-gotten reward, but Landru obviously took great pains to cover up his crimes. He sought to avoid detection and make it look like his victims were still alive. Two of Guillin's friends received postcards from Landru saying that Guillin was unable to write herself. He forged a letter from Buisson to her dressmaker and another to the concierge of her Paris apartment. Landru represented himself as the attorney of Jaumet, who was divorcing her husband and successfully closed out her bank accounts. 2 years after Buisson met Landru, her son passed away. Obviously, the family wanted to notify her but was unable to find her. Her sister remembered that Buisson had whispered her intention of running away to Gambay with a Monsieur Guillet. She wrote to the mayor of Gambay seeking help in locating either Buisson or Guillet. The mayor replied that he knew of neither of them, but perhaps she should meet the family of a Madame Colombe, who was also missing in Gambay. She had vanished under similar circumstances. Colombe disappeared after meeting Landru in early 1917. The tenant of the villa in question, the mayor told the family of Buisson, was not Monsieur Fremier, the fiancé of Colombe, or Guillet, the fiancé of Buisson, but Monsieur Dupont. However, when the police went to Villa Hermitage, as Landru's estate was known, they could not find Fremier, Dupont, Diard, or Landru. The villa was unoccupied, but recently lived in. Madame Lacoste, Buisson's sister, was not discouraged. She had seen Guillet, so she began combing the streets of Paris near his old residence looking for him. In 1919, her search paid off. She spotted Landru coming out of a dry goods shop and followed him, only to lose him in the crowd. She returned to the store and found out that the man's name was not Guillet, but Fremier, and that he lived in the Rue de Rochechouart with his mistress. Immediately the police were summoned and Landru was arrested. But on what charge should he be held, the authorities wondered. Clearly murder was suspected, but where was the body? There was no evidence that Landru had killed anyone, and the strong-willed killer was unwilling to discuss anything with authorities. They returned to Gambay, where a thorough search was undertaken. The gardens were excavated looking for bones, but the only remains police found were those of a pair of dogs. They searched his old villa at Vernouillet and came up equally empty. All the police had to go on was a cryptic memorandum book where Landru had meticulously recorded his income and expenses, but within the copious notes were several names that interested authorities. On one page was the entry, au coucher, G. Coucher, Brésil Crozatier Havre, Cite Buisson, à Colombe, André Babelet, Madame Louise, Sic, Jaume, à Pascal, Madame Tercer Mercadier. Buisson and Colombe were missing, and the authorities soon learned that the whereabouts of the coucher were also in question. They suspected this was a list of victims, but again they had no bodies. Confident in the erroneous knowledge that he could not be convicted of murder without a body, Landru kept silent and refused to talk with police. For 2 years, authorities investigated the disappearances of his victims, yet Landru never admitted anything. Slowly, they learned that each of the women in the ledger met Landru through his marriage advertisements and disappeared. Stupidly, Landru recorded the purchase of one-way tickets from Paris to Gambais for each of his victims, while marking round-trip tickets for himself. The gardens in Gambay and Vernouillet were dug up time and time again. Authorities tried to link Landru to purchases of acids and other chemicals, to no avail. Finally, neighbors at Gambay told authorities of the noxious fumes that often emanated from the kitchen. The stove that Landru had installed shortly after his arrival in Gambay was inspected, and horrific evidence of murder was uncovered. In the ashes, police found small bones, undoubtedly human as well as burned, but still recognizable fasteners of the kind worn on the clothes of French women. Landru had disposed of his victims by burning their remains. How they were killed was still a mystery, but what had happened to Colombe and Buisson, as well as the 9 others, was clear. 2 years after his arrest, Landru was charged with 11 counts of murder and set for trial. There is little doubt that Landru's trial captivated his countrymen. Consider the time it occurred. He was arrested in April 1909 at his home in Paris with his mistress, 27-year-old Mille Fernande Sigret, whom he had picked up on an bus in the city. France was still recovering from the bloodiest war in the history, and the peace talks at Versailles were not going well for them. Shortages and economic depression abounded, and a case that promised sex, gossip, and gruesome killing was delightfully played up by the papers as a diversion from the dreary day-to-day life of post-war France. Landru's trial began in November 1921 and lasted nearly a month. The French system of justice had been instituted in 1848, and while not, as is commonly believed, assuming the guilt of the accused until innocence is proven, it is heavily weighted against the person on trial. Not only does the chief judge of the 3-judge panel serve as an interrogator, the French allow questioning of the accused for the sake of investigation in front of the jury during the trial. The French system also allows relatives of the victim to bring suit for damages during the course of the trial, and the victim's legal counsel can question the accused and argue before the jury. Often the defendant is expected to rebut any adverse claims by witnesses immediately after the testimony concludes. Clinging to his mistaken belief that he could not be convicted without evidence of a body, Landru's defense was essentially to stonewall the court. Time after time, he would refuse to answer questions and would reply that it was no one else's business what he knew of their disappearances. For days he stood before withering interrogation by the court without changing his story. "I have nothing to say," he said over and over, much to the frustration of observers. Every time new evidence was unearthed, Landru merely shrugged his shoulders and denied everything or refused to discuss it. "I am a gallant man and will say nothing," Landru replied to the exasperated magistrate. "I cannot think of revealing the nature of my relations with Madame Guillain without the lady's permission." Landru's impudence before the court clearly grated on the jury. His evasions and quickness to answer with sarcasm only succeeded in proving that he was the kind of man who would deceive women like his victims. It took the jury just 2 hours after nearly 25 days of testimony to decide Landru had killed the 11 women. The penalty for such a crime was death. French justice is swift. Just 2 months passed from the time of his conviction until Landru received word that his execution was imminent. The French system did not inform the condemned until very shortly before the execution. In February 1922, Landru was brought before the guillotine. Landru bade farewell to his attorneys and presented them with some artwork he had drawn while in prison. Had they looked inside the frame, his attorneys would have found a written confession from Landru, admitting his crimes and the means by which he disposed of the bodies, but this was not discovered until nearly 5 decades later. He declined to hear a mass and rejected the traditional glass of brandy from his jailer. Landru indignantly refused to make a statement, saying the very question was an insult. Landru stood before the guillotine, which had been the preferred form of execution in France since its revolution a little over a century before. He knelt down, and within moments, the blade had fallen, ending the life and crimes one of the coldest mass murderers of all time.